The night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Welcome to our Wednesday night, Hump Day Night program. It's great to have everybody along with us, and we are excited about tonight's program. We have another returning guest. I'm trying to think, has all week been returning guests? Who did we have on Monday night? We had Chris Newby last night was a returning guest. I'm looking at our sheets here. Kenneth Womack talking about John Lennon. That was not a returning guest. That was a great show. Not a returning guest, though. But tonight, Colin Dickey is a returning guest. We're going to be talking about his newest book that's called The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained. We'll be talking about cryptids, the lost continents of Atlantis and Lemuria. We'll talk about UFOs. We'll talk about ghosts. We'll talk about other Fortean phenomena, including the Great Kentucky Meat Shower of 1876. I've heard about this, and it's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to talk about it tonight. You probably have heard about it too. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, search for JV Johnson. You'll find it. It's very simple. Subscribe. There's no fee for that. Also find us on Twitch. Twitch is kind of an up-and-coming video streaming service. It happens to be owned by Amazon. When you find us on Twitch by searching for JV Johnson, you will be able to follow. There's no charge or anything for following. But if you want to subscribe, which we encourage you to do, there is a fee for that unless you have Amazon Prime, because Twitch is owned by Amazon. Then you can just link your Prime account to it and get it for free, which is really cool. We've got a bunch of neat emotes that are part of the subscription, plus it's ad-free, things like that. And it supports the program. And one other way you can support the program is we have a Patreon page. We don't, ask people to do that with any seriousness, but we do appreciate it when you do. Go to Patreon and support the program. It helps us cover some of the expenses of putting all this together for you. So it's patreon.com/Joha. If you feel like something you want to do, please visit that site and do that for us. So thank you very much. If ahead of time, if you do that. Speaking of all this stuff, all this new media and things change faster than you can keep track of. And I know with me as well. I was trained in traditional media. I was trained in radio. I spent my whole professional career basically in radio. And you learn things a certain way when you're trained that way, and things are changing all around us, which is fun and exciting. It's just difficult to keep up with. And I don't know why I introduced this particular discussion this way, because today I received an email from what appeared to be Facebook. And it said, if many of you follow, I've got several Facebook pages. One of them is called Paranormal Media, TAPS Paranormal Media by JV Johnson or something like that. I'm not even sure what the exact title is. And that page has a couple 100,000 followers. And I've been targeted before because I have that many followers from hackers and people that want to get a hold of the page so that they can promote to whatever they're promoting. So today I get an email from what appeared to be Facebook, and it says, your page has been flagged for posting inaccurate COVID-19 information, and it has been scheduled for deletion because of this violation. And it goes on to say, if you want to challenge it or you want to get more information, there's a link there to click. I didn't click the link, but I'm certain the link would have brought me to a page that would have looked like a Facebook page login screen, and I would have typed in my username and password, and bam, these hackers would have had my username and password. And within minutes, all of my pages would have been, particularly the ones with high follower count, like the TAPS Paranormal Media, would no longer be in my control. And the reason I know this is it's happened to me before. It happened a long time ago, and I learned the lesson the hard way. So if you happen to see something like that, I would never click through a link on an email and enter any password, username information. Don't do it. It's 99.9% of them are scams, and it's how they get a hold of your username, password, all that stuff. If if I thought there was any legitimacy to this particular email that I got that says my page was going to be deleted because of COVID-19 misinformation, which in today's climate, you can almost believe that they might do something like that, which is ridiculous in itself. But if I thought there was any legitimacy to that, I would have just gone into my Facebook page, through my phone or on my computer, not through a link in this email, and looked for some type of message there. So, yeah, it's ridiculous. And you're absolutely right, Fiddy. I do not need anything else hacked. We've had enough of that. We're still trying to work through the problems with that. But that hacking had nothing to do with us. That was a flaw somewhere in Twitch. So, anyway, I don't mean to preach, but I'm just warning you. Anytime you see anything, I'm getting, there's a whole bunch of text scamming going on as well. People getting text saying, we have a package for you that we can't deliver, whatever. Click on this link and sort it out. Well, it's just another scam. Absolute another scam. So be very cautious in today's day and age. Don't give your password or user information to anyone through an email or a text or anything like that. If you think there's a legitimate issue going on, then go right to the company that is supposedly issuing it, whether it's Facebook or whatever it happens to be. Let's do this. Let's take a break. We'll get Colin Dickey on the line, and we'll begin our conversation. We're going to be talking about his new book. It's called The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained. Much of what we talk about here is the unexplained. So we're going to have a great conversation tonight with Colin. It's Beyond Reality, and we will be right back. Don't go away.
Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johaw. That's JOHAW.
Our guest, Colin Dickey, is a returning guest to the program. He's a cultural historian. We're talking about his newest book. It's called The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained. Colin, welcome to Beyond Reality. It's great to have you back with us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me back.
What have you been up to? I mean, I'm trying to remember when you were on last. It's been, I don't know, long enough that
back in December. I think it was around Christmas. We were talking about ghosts then, because I'm a big believer that Christmas is a good ghost holiday.
That's
even
right.
More so than Halloween. I think that's probably the last time we talked.
That's right. That was great. That was a lot of fun. Well, it's great to have you back with us. I assume you're still up to all the same things, doing the same research, obviously writing books since we've talked to you last.
Yeah, so this one was, I moved off of ghosts and I moved into aliens and UFOs and cryptids, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, that kind of stuff, and then the lost continents of Atlantis and Lemuria.
I mean, it's a natural thing to do when you have a curiosity, whether it's about ghosts or whatever it happens to be. That same curiosity applies to all of those other things that you mentioned. If you're curious about one thing, you're probably going to be curious about all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I was really surprised because, I mean, I think, belief in ghosts, that's something that you find, across the world in every culture, in every country. You find it, way back, as long as we've been keeping records, we've been, recording ghost stories. And I thought, I grew up on Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and UFOs and stuff. But I had kind of thought when I started this project, I thought that some of that stuff had kind of died down. That people, those weren't as sort of prevalent, these days. But it turns out that no, when I started sort of poking into it, it's like that people are more and more believing, in that Bigfoot exists, that aliens visited this planet and, whatever, ancient Egypt and stuff like that. So I got way more fascinated because I kind of assumed this stuff had kind of gone away. And in fact, it's sort of roaring back in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it really has in a lot of different ways. It's making a lot of pop cultural inroads in addition to people like yourself researching and writing about it. Obviously, we're seeing it on this program a lot. But let's talk about our fascination with these things. What is it about the unexplained that just fascinates almost everybody in some way or another?
What was interesting for me when I started kind of looking into this, I mean, as I said, belief in ghosts, we've always believed in ghosts. That's a solid part of human existence. But, cryptids are much more recent phenomenon. I don't think that cryptids really come onto the scene until the 20th century. So I wanted to kind of figure out, I mean, we used to believe in monsters in a kind of medieval sense, right? You sort of picture the medieval map of the world and there'd be dragons and weird things kind of lurking on the margins. But those seemed I was are those the same things as Bigfoot? Is that, so I kind of wanted to maybe sort of try and understand, where these things kind of came from. And it seemed to me, you know, the conclusion I came to is that, you know, what happens in like the 19th century is that there's, you know, science and religion kind of split off from one another, and each one kind of pretends that it sort of completely understands the world. You know, it's got a system that completely understands everything. And when that happens, there's still a bunch of weird stuff left on the table, you know, kind of stuff in the middle that, you know, science doesn't have great answers for, religion doesn't really seem to want to touch, but it's there. And, you know, what became the kind of focus of this book is this, you know, the stuff that's almost kind of the leftover, the remainders, you know, that we can't quite slot into these other kind of belief systems, but yet kind of stubbornly persist one way or another.
Are the most fascinating questions the ones that we know we will probably never get an answer to, despite how hard we try to get? We get theories, we get ideas, but true, hard, and fast answers are near impossible for some of these questions.
Oh yeah, and that's the thing is I tried to, as best I could, try and, you know, figure out if I could understand what was happening with a lot of these cases. And, you know, some of the stuff, it's a little, you know, like, I don't know, that photograph was probably faked, or I don't know if that guy was a particularly reliable eyewitness. But
right.
Yeah, I kept coming back to these stories, and in some ways they were the ones that surprised me. They weren't the ones I was thinking were going to be, you know, the real unsolved mysteries, but I kept coming back to, like, the Gloucester Sea Serpent of, you know, 1817 as, like, you know, like, I just, like, what is it? What happened? And I mean, I think there are these stories that I think are always going to be just outside the reach of what we can know, and yet not so far out that we can dismiss them entirely. And that's the stuff that I really love tracking down in this book and writing about. The
one thing that mankind has been searching for forever are answers to things like, is there life after death? You know, these more mystical or spiritual questions have always plagued them until they start, when I say they, I mean mankind, is introduced to things like the Loch Ness Monster, or things like a round disc that they see flying through the sky that they can't explain. And then our attention has changed a little bit. But it all comes from, I imagine, the same part of our being that is thirsty for answers.
Right. And I mean, I think you hit it when you say that, you know, like, when we talk about ghosts, it's like, you know, is there life after death? You know, what happens to ourselves after we die? And what is that all about? Those, you know, that's the kind of question that I think, you know, belief in, or, you know, the idea of a ghost really sort of provokes in us. Whereas, like, with UFOs or aliens, it's like, you know, what is it? It's kind of a different question. It's like, what does it mean to be human? What are these other things that, you know, look like us, and maybe they could communicate to us, but they're not us. They're different, and they, you know, like in the 50s, people thought of, you know, as you know, they thought of aliens as, like, you know, guys with flowing blonde hair and silver jumpsuits. They looked like us, right? They were just like, they just had better cars, right? You know, and then that sort of, by the 80s, we had this totally different vision of these, you know, kind of triangle head dudes with big eyes and long, skinny bodies that were, you know, like, so, like, you know, we've kind of, how we see aliens kind of changes over the years. And I thought that was kind of a fascinating kind of reflection of almost like how we see ourselves in the process.
Some of the mysteries that you talk about, and we're going to get into a lot of the stuff that you've included in the book, but some of them, you know, are what we would call chronic head scratchers. Some of them are time related. In other words, you know, the lost continent of Atlantis was lost to time, if in fact it was. You know, some of the mysteries, like, and I'm not sure we're going to talk about this tonight, but things like the pyramids, obviously they were created. We just don't know how, because that secret has been lost to time. How much of what you looked into is relative to being lost to time?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, you know the Freudian term, you know, the uncanny, right? You know, the uncanny is this idea that something is sort of like, it's close to normal, but there's something just a little bit off, and that thing that's off is, like, makes it even creepier. You know, like the way that a doll is uncanny. And a doll is uncanny because it looks like a human, but it's just off in just enough way that it's actually kind of creepy. And I think that, like, kind of what you're saying, I think a lot of this has to do with, like, the past has become a kind of, in some ways, a kind of uncanny space for us, right? Like, it sort of, it looks like us, and it's close to who we are, but it's off or it's weird or it's different in some way, and that's actually like even weirder than if it made no sense whatsoever. So I think when you're talking about like things that are lost to time, a lot of times I think it's like the stuff that has that kind of uncanny resonance to us. It's like it's close to who we are, it's close to how we think, but it's just different enough that it's actually like it provokes all these questions, like where, how did this thing get here, and where did it come from, and what does it mean, and what are we supposed to do with it, and that kind of stuff.
One of the things that's always made me curious about being curious is how much of our curiosity stems from just wanting an answer versus how much of our curiosity stems from fear of the unknown. And as long as something remains unknown, we have this natural fear, so therefore we want to explain it so that we don't have to fear it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, like this book eventually I moved into kind of modern conspiracy theories and, kind of particularly around UFOs, right? Because you kind of can't believe in aliens without also believing somehow that there's like a government conspiracy, right? Like it's kind of, they go hand in hand. One of the things I think I've found about conspiracy theories is like, it is almost like, it is more reassuring to think there's a terrible, malevolent conspiracy theory that's like controlling every action and every thought. That's almost more reassuring than the idea that there's an unknown, right? The fear of the unknown is almost even worse than, some horrible government conspiracy that's like, ruining our lives or something like that, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think there is that kind of deep fear of the unknown that drives some of this. And then I think the flip side is there's also that like that craving for the unknown. Like, like there's, you see something weird, you want to know the answer, and then almost as soon as you know the answer, you're like, oh, that's kind of a letdown. It's like figuring out how a card trick works. You want that kind of unknown. You want that kind of that mystery, and I think we go searching for it even when we sometimes already know the answers.
And when you started to think about the concept for this book, how did you come to the idea of writing this particular piece?
I mean, so I started with just a big grab bag of, various conspiracy theories and other, I guess, what we call like Fortean beliefs, sort of the stuff that Charles Fort, kind of put on the map. And I had a whole big pile of things. I was going to talk about like, the guys who believe in the earth being flat and a bunch of other stuff. And what I finally settled on, I think the thing that connected it was like, all of this stuff is, I like to think of it as like it's the stuff that's out in the edges of civilization, right? Because if you think about like, where is Bigfoot? Bigfoot is like in the northern California, redwood forests, which are unfortunately on fire right now. But it's sort of just outside of San Francisco. It's just outside of civilization. Or like Area 51 is in the Nevada desert, sort of just outside of Las Vegas. So I there's a kind of the thing that seemed to connect all these things is this idea that these were places that were kind of out on the frontiers and out on the edges, and they were just on the edge of civilization, but in this kind of weird wilderness, kind of weird marginal place. And I think that there's something like really like alluring and kind of exciting and kind of fascinating about those kinds of places. And they tend to be the places that we find these kind of, these strange denizens that seem to sort of inhabit these kind of spaces right on the edge.
The ideas of cryptids, we've thrown some names out already, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, Jersey Devil, things like that, UFOs, and then also things like lost continents. These seem to be very, very different ideas, but you view them all kind of in the same basket in the sense that these are the things that we are obsessed about as being unexplained. How did you connect all these things together?
Yeah, well, the one of the places I went to is Mount Shasta. And I don't know if people out there have been to Mount Shasta, but it is it's strikingly beautiful. It's a gorgeous mountain in Northern California, right on the edge of Oregon, and it's also according to some, it's the last remnant of the lost continent of Lemuria, and underneath Mount Shasta is the city of Telos, where the Lemurians live, and I found you can find descriptions of Lemurians, and sometimes they're described as these kind of 8-foot tall, hairy creatures that don't speak any language, but kind of, roam around the mountains. And sometimes they're described as sort of flying around in these ships that come in and out of Telos. And it's like, it just like hit me. I was like, oh, this is the Lemurians are sort of simultaneously aliens, they're simultaneously Bigfoot, they're kind of all these things kind of condensed together, and so you see kind of throughout these different, if you kind of follow these stories through the decades and see how they sort of relate to each other, they all kind of, tend to overlap. I mean, like, that the first big story about UFOs and aliens out of Amazing Stories, the science fiction magazine in the 1940s is called I Remember Lemuria, right? So there's all these sort of weird connections that I kept finding that I felt like these stories tended to kind of overlap and influence each other in these kind of weird ways.
Tell us a little bit more about Lemuria. I mean, most people have heard of Atlantis, but not everybody has heard of about Lemuria.
Yeah, I think Lemuria is a really weird, kind of fun story. I mean, so the easiest way to think of it is like it's the Atlantis of the Pacific Ocean, right? It's also sort of theorized as a lost continent, and like what it was. The name comes from this geologist in the 1860s who was trying to figure out why there are lemurs in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa. And he proposes, well, what if there was like a kind of land bridge that connected Madagascar and India, and then it subsequently sank? So he calls it Lemuria. And like, geologists are like, yeah, we don't really buy that. So it gets kind of dropped in mainstream science, but it gets picked up. It gets picked up by the Theosophists, particularly, Madame Blavatsky and other people who sort of see it as this maybe sort of lost mythical place where these kind of, either sort of super advanced or maybe not quite as advanced kind of humans, once lived. And so that's, eventually it gets kind of worked into kind of, California mythology, which is how Mount Shasta becomes the home of the Lemurians. There's this guy, Harvey Spencer Lewis, who built the Rosicrucian Museum in San Jose, California, where I grew up, which is this cool, strange Egyptian temple. It's got all this like cool Egyptology stuff. But he was a big believer that California was itself the last remnant of Lemuria, that had somehow sort of drifted into North America and kind of crashed into it, and thus you could find, traces of Lemuria if you went sort of hunting around in the kind of California wilderness. That
might explain why California is so strange. That might be the first explanation I've heard.
And he's like, this is what makes California so great. Like, he's like a real booster for the state. He should have, done like tourism for them, because he's like, California's amazing because it's populated by Lemurians. It's great.
It's funny. I don't know what the theories are. I mean, you've just given us a little bit of information there. But when somebody says, yeah, it's not possible for a civilization to just disappear, et cetera, whatever the skeptics say, I often point to Pompeii. I mean, a whole city was basically buried in a blink of an eye. And it wasn't if it wasn't so close to Rome, nobody would have known it ever existed. And just look at how a natural disaster like that can completely swallow up thousands of people instantly.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I think we're like, even very mainstream traditional archaeology and geology. I mean, we're still learning stuff all the time. And in fact, when I was almost done with this book, I found, there are news reports that, they think that maybe they have found something that may be the lost continent of Lemuria out in the Indian Ocean. And it's not some fantastical civilization home to, crazy advanced humans, but it is like, this continent that had sort of shifted or broken up or dissolved or somehow sort of, got subsumed into continental drift or whatever. But, it sort of fits the pattern of what they think Lemuria, should have looked like. So, we're finding this stuff all the time. We're always finding kind of new and strange discoveries. And I think the mistake is to think that science has got it all figured out and it's all done, when in fact we're constantly learning things every year.
There are some people from the 19th and early 20th century that are kind of important, and you talk about them at length in the first part of the book. Let's take them one at a time. Charles Fort, and his last name Fort is where we get the descriptive term of Fortean, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's this term that sort of evolves in the early 20th century, it's a crank, right? A crank is somebody who has some kind of theory about the world that sort of looks scientific, but maybe it's not recognized by mainstream science, and you get scientists at the time sort of writing about cranks and how sort of annoying they are. And Charles Fort he started as a journalist, but then he decided he was going to be in his own words, he was going to be a crank. He wanted to be a crank. He wrote this one book that it was something about how Martians control our behavior through radio waves or something like that. But he couldn't get it published and burned the manuscript. So we only know what it was through letters that he wrote and stuff like that. But he kind of can't quite make it as sort of kind of pushing out these kind of radical, strange theories. So instead, what he does is he writes this book in 1919 called The Book of the Damned, which is, I assume a bunch of your listeners have read it, but if they haven't, man, you gotta read this book right away. It's so good. But it's basically what he does is he just gathers up all this weird stuff he keeps finding in news reports and scientific journals, the stuff that doesn't make any sense, and he calls it The Book of the Damned. He says these are the facts that are damned by science. They're sort of not allowed. They've been excluded from the narrative because they don't, fit and they don't make sense. But one way or another, we got to take them seriously. They happened, and here they are, and I don't know what they mean, and you don't know what they mean either. But somebody's got to at least talk about them. And so that's, the Book of the Damned is just this great catalog of all the stuff that he found. Everything from frogs falling from the sky, which is kind of the most famous thing he's known for. But fish that turn into blood, and weird, just strange goings on, and ball lightning, and the Bermuda Triangle, and just all this stuff comes out of Charles Fort just kind of combing through the records, finding these strange little bits and pieces and news reports, and sort of gathering them all up together.
How do you do that in the time period that he was doing it? It's hard enough to do it with the internet available to us. I can't even imagine doing that kind of research and that kind of work in a time when you had to go, comb through newspapers that you'd probably have to travel to the location or have them mailed to you in one form or another to get a copy of them.
Well, so Charles Fort was really lucky because he lived in New York, and this is the 19-teens, and in 1912, the New York Public Library opened, and he was it was one of those perfect marriages of, the New York Public Library and Charles Fort, because what he would do is he would just go there every morning, and they have just this amazing periodical stack, and he would read, and he would make these notes on in this little tiny cryptic handwriting in these little slips of paper that then he would go home and he would stuff in these kind of pigeonholes that he had all around his apartment in this sort of Byzantine filing system that he has. And so if you well, I don't know what the status is now, but normal non-pandemic times, you can go and you can see these slips of paper because the New York Public Library has them. They were donated after his death. So one of the best things I did for the research is I got to go and sort of look at Charles Fort's handwriting and try and decipher these little crazy notes. And there's all sorts of stuff in there that I found that, wasn't in any of his books. So it's was this stuff not weird enough to make it into a book, or was this, maybe for a future book that he didn't get around to write, or what do you do with all this crazy stuff? And so it was a cool sort of experience. And again, you just get this sense of this guy who just sees the world and sort of reads these things in a way that, nobody else had really done before that.
It's fascinating, and it's admirable that people braved reputation and in some cases scorn to research and then write about this type of thing. But what's important here is how much of research did you do into this attitude that science has now, and at some point it copped this attitude, where it almost puts its hand in the face of anybody who has an idea that may be a little bit out of the mainstream.
Yeah, it was a weird time. I think that the late 19th century, there were so many things going on that now we just kind of take for granted.
Yeah.
But you think about it, I don't know, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, if you were a guy with a telescope and a little bit of spare time, you could make all kinds of new scientific discoveries, right? There was just so much that was just unknown then, and people were just sort of discovering things left and right. kind of dilettantes like Benjamin Franklin and stuff like that, and so what happens in the second half of the 19th century is you get, what I guess I would call the sort of institutionalization of science. Like science is now a kind of thing that requires a PhD and a lab and some grant funding and, like all this stuff that, and again, it's important stuff. I mean, we wouldn't get, cures for diseases. We wouldn't understand the solar system without this kind of stuff, but it does stop being a kind of place for amateurs to play around in, and it starts to be a kind of, professionalized, organized institution. And I think one of the weird side effects from that is this kind of backlash and this kind of revolt among people like Charles Ford and other people who are just who see that as kind of a personal affront, that they're sort of being locked out of, that kind of joy of kind of, pursuing these kind of scientific beliefs. And so they tend to sort of be on the outside with a kind of more kind of, I guess, confrontational attitude, I guess.
Tell us about Ignatius Donnelly.
Yeah, Ignatius Donnelly is really the first guy who gives us the idea of the continent of Atlantis, right? Atlantis gets mentioned first in Plato's dialogues, like the ancient Greek philosopher, Socrates is talking about this, this continent of Atlantis. But it's kind of a myth. It's like a story he's telling. It's kind of philosophical idea. It's not clear that Plato thought this was a real place. But Ignatius Donnelly, so he is a kind of failed land speculator in the 1850s who then goes into Congress, and he serves in Congress for a couple of years. He's from Minnesota. And then eventually he leaves Congress, and he's looking for a third act, and he stumbles upon this story of Atlantis, and he writes this book in 1874, called Atlantis, the Lost Continent, in which he proposes, unlike Plato, and that this is not just a mythical idea or something, but this was a real place, and he sort of proposes, the kind of geology and the archaeology and the culture, and he, kind of grabs all this stuff together. And he's not a trained archaeologist. He's just kind of, again, it's just kind of the sense of anybody should be able to do this stuff. You shouldn't need a degree to do this. And so Ignatius Donnelly, he's the first person to kind of put this forward, and it's a huge bestseller. People are totally fascinated by this idea, and that kind of sets in motion this idea that, Atlantis might actually be a real place.
So could we fairly and accurately say that he introduced it to pop culture?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't have Aquaman, you wouldn't have, resorts in the Caribbean called Atlantis if it wasn't for Ignatius Donnelly. He really he pulls it out of, Greek philosophy, and he brings it to the rest of the world and says, look, this is a real place. And everybody from Charles Darwin to the mayor of London are reading it and sending him letters saying, some of them are it seems a little sketchy, but other people are yeah, I'm totally convinced. And that's really, Ignatius Donnelly really gave us the concept of Atlantis.
And since that time, people have done some serious investigation and research on the idea of a continent that existed that we call Atlantis. And there's been some physical evidence to prove that it might be true. Did you get to look into any of that?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, there's been a lot of stuff. There's another great book that I highly recommend by this guy, Mark McAdams, who wrote a history about kind of the contemporary researchers of Atlantis. He followed some guys who are very clear about where they think it is. They've got coordinates. They've got, they've got all this stuff. And I kind of, I stayed a little bit away from the contemporary stuff because I feel like Mark's book really kind of nailed that. And I didn't want to redo what he'd already done. But
sure.
What I think I found really interesting about Atlantis is this idea that it as I was saying before, what seems to be the real draw is it's always going to be not quite reachable, right? It's sort of like the world keeps getting kind of closer and closer, and with kind of globalization, sort of everything gets more and more kind of collected together. And Atlantis is always, there's never going to be a Starbucks in Atlantis, right? There's never going to be a McDonald's in Atlantis. There's always going to be this place that is as you were saying before, it's sort of like outside of time, or it's sort of, it's this kind of this uncanny presence that's close to us, but yet always just a little bit outside of our reach. And I think that's part of the reason I think why we're kind of so interested in, and we kind of keep coming back to it, because we'll never get there. You know what I mean? Like, it's always going to be like one more train stop away.
Where is the prevailing thought of the location of Atlantis?
As I said, I've seen different things. It's usually somewhere in the Mediterranean,
Right.
kind of off of North Africa a little bit. But again, it sort of seems to shift depending on who you're talking to, and also, people go out and then they kind of don't find what they're looking for, so then they got to kind of retool their model a little bit. So it seems to kind of float a little bit somewhere in the Mediterranean, just north of Africa, I think.
Madame Blavatsky? Who is Madame Blavatsky?
So yeah, Madame Blavatsky is another sort of like, again, when I think about kind of, the kind of fringe culture that, is so prevalent in pop culture right now, and sort of driving things like, the X-Files and Ancient Aliens and all the stuff that like is really kind of present. I kept coming back to these three people. I kept coming back to Ignatius Donnelly, Charles Fort, and Madame Blavatsky as these kind of three figures who really kind of sowed the seeds for kind of a lot of what we believe now, or at least a lot of what we're interested now. And so she was like, she starts as a spiritualist, but then she kind of differentiates herself from spiritualism. She doesn't like the idea that there's sort of life after death. That just doesn't interest her in the same way. And she's more interested in this idea that there's been a kind of evolution of humanity from a kind of higher evolved state through a kind of steadily devolving evolution into like who we are now, right? And so we're now kind of semi-corrupt beings that aren't as pure and perfect as we used to be, and maybe we can, through the teachings of Blavatsky and theosophy, which is the kind of religion that she creates, it's this idea of like, this is how we can get back to this earlier kind of state of being. But she really she's the one who really introduces the idea that there are these kind of other races of sort of beings, maybe they're kind of Bigfoot looking, or maybe they're kind of alien looking, but she kind of first puts that out there, and that seems to take root, or at least it resonates for people, with what they see later on. So I think she kind of gives us that in this kind of weird way. What
was it about the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century that there was such a, I don't know what the word is, but you've got people like Charles Fort, Madame Blavatsky, and Ignatius Donnelly all thinking outside of the box? Is it because there were so many new discoveries and things being invented, that technology was changing so fast that people started to think anything was possible? Was that part of it at all?
I think I think you're absolutely right. I think there was a kind of massive kind of, series of kind of technological shifts and like discoveries, and like the world just changed really fast, in a dramatic couple of decades. I mean, you think of where the world was in like 1865 versus where it was in like 1910. I mean, just like leaps and bounds, right? And so, people were sort of looking for the next big thing, because the next big thing kept coming. So it was sort of not irrational or weird to think that we were all going to discover something new and dramatic, in a week from now, because, everything seemed up for grabs. I think the other thing I would say, is that there's this sense, I think I mentioned this before, that the world was kind of becoming less magical, right? We had kind of mapped the world. There wasn't anything left to discover. There wasn't anywhere left to go, right? We had kind of figured out all the nooks and crannies of the world. And I think people began to look for and kind of yearn for a magic that they felt that maybe like modern life was like kind of robbing from them, if that makes sense. Like there was no sense now that there was some sort of kind of magical frontier beyond which we wouldn't know exactly what was out there. And so people started to kind of look for that and kind of imagine other ways for that kind of magical frontier to persist.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, too, and I think we're seeing that today. And you said, look at 1865 to 1910. We probably could do a pretty interesting comparison to look at 1965 to 2010 and the technological advancements that we've seen in our lifetime here, almost as head-spinning, I would say. And there is a call among people now saying, okay, we need to start stepping away from our screens. We almost yearn for the simplicity prior to smartphones and prior to computers running everything. And I can almost take that attitude and put it on to 1910 America as well.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a great parallel. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that, like, the more we become kind of locked into modern life, in whatever form it's taking in our lifetime, right? For us, it's like iPhones and internet and social media and stuff like that. The more that becomes, like, dominating to us, the more we start to kind of yearn for and imagine something that's kind of the opposite. And so I think, the kind of rise that we've seen in the past, 10 years or so of people who, style themselves as, Bigfoot hunters or Bigfoot researchers, or people who want to go out into the forest and look for, a Sasquatch or something like that. I mean, I think that part of that, is just like almost a rejection of, I don't know, your iPhone and your Facebook account, just kind of wanting to get off grid and sort of find that thing that, doesn't exist in modern life, that is sort of a complete, kind of repudiation of modern life.
Tonight we've got Colin Dickey with us. He's a cultural historian. He's written a lot of books, including the one we're talking about tonight, The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained. He's also got books called Ghostland, An American History and Haunted Places, Afterlives of the Saints, Stories from the Ends of Faith, and Cranioclepty, Grave Robbing, and the Search for Genius. I think that when you were on, as you said, near Christmas time, was Ghostland relatively new at that point, Colin?
I'm
trying to remember.
I think Ghostland came out in 2016, so a couple of years.
I remember
newish, I guess.
I remember talking about that, and
favorite.
I think we may have talked about the grave robbing book as well. That was about particularly about a story about an individual. I'm trying to remember. Tell us what cranioclepty is.
Yeah, no, this is it blew my mind that nobody had really discussed this. What I found, I kept finding stories that true stories in the early 19th century about how various people had stolen the heads of famous writers and musicians. So Mozart and Franz Joseph Haydn, the composer, Emanuel Swedenborg, the writer Thomas Browne, and parts of Beethoven's skull were stolen by various people, many of whom were phrenologists, which is, the whole thing that, like, the bumps on your head determine your personality. And so they were trying to get the heads of genius composers and writers to see if they could kind of scope out the bumps that would, lead to musical genius and whatnot. And it was just like this crazy story that, like, if it had been one time, it would have been a weird curiosity, but instead it was like a bunch of times, and it kept happening, and I kept finding more and more stories. I mean, Franz Joseph Haydn, a friend of his, waited until he was had been dead for 5 days before bribing the gravedigger to dig up his corpse. Sorry, that's gross, but dig up his corpse, decapitate his body, and then he, this friend of his, this guy Karl Rosenbaum, made off with Franz Joseph Haydn's head, which he cleaned and parsed down to a bleached skull, and then he put the skull in a glass case on his mantle and, kept it there for the next couple of decades. And I was just trying to imagine doing that to a friend of mine, and I just couldn't quite figure out how I would sort of, kind of get behind that activity. But that was a thing that I kept coming across, so I ended up writing a book about it, yeah.
This I'm listening to you tell this story. I had never heard of it before. Is this actually true?
Oh yeah, no, it's 100% true, and it's the guy Karl Rosenbaum, he kept a very detailed diary, and in fact, he knew he was going to do this, so he actually did a test run about a year before Haydn died on an actress whom he dug up her body, he cut off her head, he tried to clean the skull himself, although it got a little moldy, I think, in the process. He described in his diary that it got a little greenish, and so we don't really know what happened to her head. But the second time around, second time's the charm. When he got Haydn's skull, he had it professionally cleaned, and and he's no shame about putting it in in his diary. And, same thing with Emanuel Swedenborg, who is this, Swedish mystic who died in London, was buried in London, and his head was actually stolen twice by two different people, and it led to this scientific conundrum in the early 20th century where people were trying to figure out which head was the authentic Swedenborg cranium, so they could figure out which one to rebury with the rest of his body. So yeah, this stuff is all like, it was all true, it was all talked about, and yet, nobody had really thought to ask why, at least that I've, before I came along, nobody really thought to ask, what connects all of these strange stories of stealing people's skulls, and why would you do that? So that's what I tried to figure out myself.
When I was in grade school, we had these book fairs or whatever. The service would come around and the kids could walk into the gym and it would be all these books on tables and you could take two books and they were yours. And
yeah, I remember those.
And one of the books that came out when I was that age that was available that became, they couldn't keep them in stock because every kid wanted one, was called The Book of Lists. Do you remember that book?
No, I don't. Tell me about it.
It was kind of like a Guinness Book of World Records, but it basically just had lists. And one of the lists in that book that I remember distinctly, although I don't remember what was on the list, but it was a list of body parts of famous people that had been saved after their death. And there were a lot of really strange ones. And I don't remember the list, but I remember there were a bunch from Napoleon that had been taken from his body and saved after his death and things like that. And that, that list as a kid, I was a young kid reading this thing. It kind of creeped me out like crazy thinking that these body parts were removed. And you just made me relive that with this story you told.
Amazing. I don't know exactly what age demographic this book was pitched to, but I know that there was one body part in particular, Napoleon, that was saved.
Yes, I know which one you're talking about. And that was on the list, and I remember that distinctly.
Oh, good. Okay.
That's funny. Anyway, so before the break, I teased one of the stories that you write about in the book, and particularly Charles Fort wrote about it as well. It's called The Great Kentucky Meat Shower, and my chat room went nuts when I said that with all sorts of jokes and stuff. Tell us what the Great Kentucky Meat Shower was.
Again, this is when, doing the research for a book like this just really pays off because, yeah, I came across that phrase, first years ago in Charles Fort, the Great Kentucky Meat Shower, and immediately I was like, I need to know everything that there is to know about it. So, okay, so basically the story is, in March of 1876 in this little town called Olympia Springs, Kentucky, which is right on the border of West Virginia, this woman, Mrs. Crouch, and her grandson are out one day. It's a clear, clear sky, cloudless day, and all of a sudden it starts to rain meat from the sky. Chunks of meat, maybe at most a couple inches in diameter, and it just starts raining meat. And the meat, it's over, maybe 100 square foot patch of land, and the thing about the Great Kentucky Meat Shower is a lot of the stuff you could say, well, that's a hoax, or, maybe they hallucinated it or something. But this, one way or another, the Great Kentucky Meat Shower absolutely happened because the whole town came out. They gathered up the samples of meat. There were two incredibly brave souls that again, this is one of those things I can't even fathom what goes through a man's mind. But two guys actually tried to eat the meat to see if they could identify it through taste. Neither one of them got very far. Although apparently the farm animals ate some of the meat, and only the dog got sick. The rest of them, didn't have a problem with it. And so this becomes a question: where does this meat come from, right? And there's a fierce and lively debate in a bunch of scientific journals where scientists and biologists and naturalists are writing back and forth, and they're saying, well, I think it's frog spawn, or I think it's some specific kind of fungus or something, various things, and none of that makes, none of that holds too much water. There's somebody gets a sample of it and is able to determine, under a microscope that it is most likely either horse meat or human infant,
Human
which
infant?
apparently looks a lot. Yeah, human infant, which apparently looks a lot like horse meat under the microscope. So, I don't know what to make of that. Although the ramifications are pretty disturbing, and so again, the scientists kind of they have a couple of solutions, and there is a kind of accepted explanation of what happened on that day, but I frankly don't quite buy it. The story is that it was most likely a pack of vultures who group vomited. Apparently vultures, when they need to gain altitude, they will lighten the load by vomiting the contents of their stomach. But if that was the case, then the eyewitnesses would have reported seeing a bunch of vultures flying overhead, and there were no reports of that. There's no it would take a lot of vultures to throw up that much meat, and there was just no indication that anybody saw a huge pack of giant birds flying overhead. So I come back to the Great Kentucky Meat Shower because it's like it happened. We know it happened. We know what it was. We have some theories for what caused it, but none of them fit, perfectly. None of them fit well enough to where you can kind of just dust your hands and say, case closed. And I think, that's the kind of story that I think that is a really kind of cool and fascinating one, and one worth kind of keeping in the forefront of your mind.
Those types of stories,
it's also totally gross.
Those types of stories are the best because they're they become part of local legend. But again, remind me of what was the date of the Kentucky Meat Shower?
So it's 1876.
1876. So clearly not an airplane. Nothing falling out of an airplane or anything. And then
exactly.
Did any of the reports, the contemporary reports, indicate whether the meat looked like it was cut by a sharp object like a knife, or did it look like it was roadkill kind of meat? I mean, do you get any sense of that?
The sense that I got, it didn't seem to be like prepared in any way. It seemed to be just sort of kind of ragged chunks one way or the other. There's a great story. So the New York newspaper, I think it's the New York Herald, sends a reporter out to Olympia Springs to see if he can, figure it out, because it becomes a national news story, right? So the New York Herald sends a reporter out. He gets himself a sample of the meat, and he's like, "Well, I'm not going to eat this crap." So he he goes down. He hires somebody he describes as an Irish laborer, and he says, "Okay, I'm going to pay this laborer to eat this meat and tell me what it's like." So the guy agrees to do it, and you have this image of this reporter sitting across from this kind of working guy at a table, and on the table in front of him, some bar or something, and there's just this hunk of mysterious sky meat, and the Irish guy starts to have second thoughts. So the first thing he says is, I can't have meat without something to wash it down, right? And so the reporter's like, all right, and he gets him a shot of whiskey, and he's like, all right, now you got some whiskey, have it to me. And the Irish guy's still not having it. And he's like, you know what, you got to have sides, right? You can't just have meat without your veggies or whatever. And so the reporter's got to then get him a bunch of I don't know, potatoes and broccoli or whatever. And it's like, okay, now it's time to get the meat, and the guy's still stalling for time, and then finally just says, I just remembered it's Lent. I can't eat meat during Lent. And he just splits and takes off.
Oh, wow. Now, is it true that you also managed to actually track down a piece of this meat that has been preserved?
Yeah, so this is another thing that blew my mind, is that there is still a piece of meat from the Great Kentucky Meat Shower. And again, I didn't know this when I started writing the book or started looking into this. It was sort of late in the research process. I got word that at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, this art professor named Kurt Godey knew of a chunk of the Great Kentucky Sky Meat. So I went out to Lexington, and sure enough, he shows me this old bottle with this wood stopper, and then in faded script on the label it says Olympia Springs, and then there is this thing and this kind of alcohol preservative, and it's kind of this, it's about an inch in diameter, and it's puffy, and it's white. It's maybe a little gelatinous. It's really gross and strange, but kind of beautiful in its own kind of way. And like, you know, it seems to be, you know, I mean, that as best Kurt or anybody else can figure out, it seems to be, you know, the last extant piece of the Great Kentucky Meat Shower. And so, you know, I got to hang out with Sky Meat. You know, one of the things is he got a DNA test done on it, and the DNA test was inconclusive, so we can't tell, you know, through modern means what kind of meat it was. It was just, I guess, it's deteriorated too much. You can't get a good DNA sample, but it's there, you know. And again, it's just like, it's just this thing, and I don't know what to make of it other than it's cool and weird, and it defies any conventional explanation, and there it sits.
And the two possible identifications you gave us earlier, you said possibly horse meat, possibly human infant. Depending on which of the two that it is, if it's one of those two, the explanations would be completely different, right? I mean, those are two very different things.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that that those two possibilities are pretty different.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and that's the thing about it, is like, you're so close to knowing what it is, but it's just off enough that in fact
right.
It's like, it's strange and uncanny.
What if somebody shot a cannon, because there were cannon then, either like into a horse or even put a part of a horse into this cannon and shot it, and you know, that could travel quite a ways, and that meat would rain down on people, I suppose. I mean, I'm trying to think outside the box a little bit. Is
that something you do on your like Saturdays? And you're like, I'm bored. You know, I already finished my chores. Let's load up the cannon with some meat.
You know, but I've seen teenagers do crazy things with what they have available at this time. So who knows? Maybe a bunch of teenagers had a cannon sitting around, and the family horse just got too close to it when they fired it. Who knows? Anyway, it's an amazing story. It really is. And the fact that the meat is actually stored at the University of Transylvania, and I know we're not talking about Romania here, we're talking about Kentucky, but still, what a perfect place for that meat to be kept.
Oh yeah, and it's cool. It's in this place called the Monroe Musnik Museum, and again, Kurt and another guy basically just started going through all the attic spaces in Transylvania University and pulled out all this crazy stuff that had been, you know, completely forgotten about. So like, it's if you find yourself in Lexington, Kentucky, I absolutely recommend going to the Monroe Musnik Museum. It's filled with all sorts of weird wonders and kind of forgotten little magic, mystery, kind of strange stuff that has just been accumulating in the you know, crawl spaces of Transylvania University for the past 240 years or however old that place is. That's
really cool. I'm going to have to put that on my list. In the book, you also talk about the Gloucester. Is it Gloucester? Is that how you pronounce that? The sea serpent?
I always get in trouble with Massachusetts pronunciation. You know, it's like Worcester. Like I can Gloucester, never quite, you know. So Gloucester, let's say Gloucester. And people from Massachusetts, feel free to yell at me and, you know, curse my family or whatever.
They will.
Yeah. Yeah, they will. I know. I spent a couple of years in Concord, Massachusetts when I was a kid. I know the stakes here, but yeah, I believe it's Gloucester, Massachusetts. Yeah.
So there was a sea serpent sighted in Gloucester at some point, witnessed by a bunch of people. This is not a story that you hear a lot of.
You know, and it bothers me. I get upset about it. You know, one of the things is like you hear about Bigfoot, you hear about the Loch Ness Monster, you hear about the Jersey Devil, whatever. But almost always it's like the sightings are like one guy, right? It's like a guy who like wanders into a clearing. He sees Bigfoot. He, you know, grabs his camera. Maybe gets a blurry kind of out of focus shot, or maybe gets a couple frames on a Super 8 camera or something like that. And that's like the best you're going to get, right? The thing about the Gloucester Sea Serpent is it was witnessed by literally hundreds of people. And it wasn't just like one time. It wasn't just like one fleeting thing. It was like this thing hung out in Gloucester Bay off of Cape Ann, Massachusetts for like, I think, weeks. And it was basically this sea serpent that people started seeing on boats, but they also saw it on land. It was, eyewitnesses sort of pegged it at somewhere between 20 and 100 feet. Some people sort of pegged the diameter of this sea serpent as like the width of a barrel. So what is that, 2-3 feet? So we're talking about like a big animal, supposedly. And again, it was there, and it was there predictably. You had people coming up from Boston on the weekend, taking a day trip up to Cape Ann as like a thing you would do. Is like, well, there's not much else going on. Let's, we've already fired meat out of the cannon. What else is there to do? Let's go up to Gloucester Bay and see the sea serpent. And so I feel like among cryptids, this one deserves a lot more airtime than I think it gets, precisely because it's so much more. It was so much more visible and prominent and predictable than the kind of usual kind of cryptid sighting, which is fleeting and once in a lifetime kind of thing. And
I think the community there still commemorates these sightings.
Yeah, well, if you go down to the beach where it was seen, there's this big boulder on the beach, and there's an artist who painted a kind of mural of the Gloucester Sea Serpent. And to me, what it reminds me of, I don't know if you ever played Dungeons and Dragons.
I did.
But if you know the logo of Dungeons and Dragons,
sure,
the
yeah.
ampersand, the and, which is sort of coiled like a dragon, like that's what this mural kind of looks like. It's like that kind of thin, kind of coiled up on itself, kind of sea serpent. And so so it's again, it doesn't have the same kind of tourist cachet as something like Nessie and Loch Ness or something like that. But I think it's kind of a cooler story, and I was really pleased to tell it and kind of, again, do this kind of research that kind of brought a different kind of cryptid to the forefront and kind of talked about it in a different way. It was kind of, it was definitely one of the more fun moments of the book for me.
When people talk about cryptids, they basically are talking about a species that has not been recognized by science or defined by science. But scientists won't consider, in many cases, these to be undiscovered species. They, again, just put that hand in the face. But yet scientists are discovering new species all the time. This is not an unusual thing. So why are cryptids kind of the outcast?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Lauren Coleman, who I'm sure some of your listeners know, who runs the International
Sure.
Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine. He's if you know that place, the logo is the coelacanth, which was this prehistoric fish that was thought to be extinct, and then a naturalist in, I think, 1920s in South Africa found a dead coelacanth in a fisherman's net, and then subsequently was able to locate live coelacanth, so that it turns out it wasn't extinct at all; it was still living. And so Lauren's whole idea is there are a lot of animals that we used to think were mythological or magical or something like that turned out to be real, right? The great panda bear is another one that people thought the great panda bear was just like a myth until whatever, like the 1880s or whatever, when they were finally able to see a live one. And so there are examples of these creatures who we think are kind of mythological, but then they turn out to be real. And so it does happen. And I think that that's again, it's like one of these things where I think that people in the scientific community could be a little bit more open-minded about some of this stuff, because I do think that there is kind of a bleed over more often than we think. But I also think it's fair to say, my feeling about Bigfoot is, I feel like personally it was a little easier for me to believe Bigfoot in the 50s and 60s when people didn't have cameras or movie cameras on them at all times.
Yeah.
But now everybody's got a freaking phone, right? You've got a high def phone on, a high def camera on your body at all times. You'd think if people were going to find a Bigfoot out in the forest that they would get it on camera and they would put it on social media. It's sort of like where is it by now? Why haven't we seen it if everybody's got these great cameras in their pockets? So, who knows? Who knows if there's an answer to that question? But I think it is fascinating to see how these kind of beliefs kind of wax and wane with these kind of new technologies.
Yeah, and I'm in the same camp. I'm very open-minded, and I love talking to people. And we've had many on the program that fully believe in Bigfoot's existence, and they have a lot of personal anecdotes and personal evidence to support their ideas. However, like you said, the camera's in everybody's pocket. That was unheard of 30 years ago. So it's a very different world. And add to that, and I've heard something the other day that made me very curious about this too. Add to that the fact that we have these thermal cameras that you could put on a drone, hover above the forest, and they can see the body signature or the heat signature of any living creature that emits heat, for tens and scores of miles. And somebody the other day said, "Hey, we came up with this brilliant idea to use a thermal camera in the search for Bigfoot." I'm thinking, why haven't we been doing that for the last 20 years? I mean, I don't know how long those cameras have been available to the consumer at a reasonable price, but they certainly have been for the last 10 years. And it just seems like that would be a no-brainer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I hope that, I'd be really interested to see what they come up with because, it seems like we have the technology now to find these things if they're out there. And, maybe it's just a matter of, nobody's had the time or the resources, but, hopefully, if there's something to find, we should have the tools by now to find it. So, I guess we'll see what happens in the next couple of years. Not
to mention that you've got satellites circling the globe that can take pictures. I mean, has anybody looked at, Google Maps and zoomed into street level? I mean, some of those are taken from the street, but the overhead shots coming from the satellites, you can get a lot of detail. And so most of the Earth is being observed by satellites 24 hours a day. It just seems like we'd be able to catch something if it was there. Again, I'm not going to discount it completely, but man, it's harder and harder to think that if it was there, we wouldn't have caught some evidence at this point.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And again, I don't want to discount anything. I want to keep an open mind, but I also, I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see what happens in the next couple of years.
Now, the famous actor Jimmy Stewart, did he have something to do with cryptid hunting as well?
Yeah. This is another cool story that I don't know if other writers on your show have had this experience with. Like you find this one thing and you're like, oh yeah, that's the book just kind of fell into place. And like, there's this crazy story about this Yeti hand in Nepal, right? Okay, so there's supposedly this monastery that has this Yeti, this preserved Yeti hand, and so pilgrims would come and they would see this Yeti hand, and there's this American kind of billionaire philanthropist, this guy Tom Slick, who's really into cryptids, and he's funding all these Yeti expeditions in the Himalayas, and he gets to know this Irish explorer Patrick Byrne. He says, okay, go to the monastery and see if you can get this Yeti hand. We'll find out what's going on. So Patrick Byrne goes there, and the monks are like, no, you cannot have our Yeti hand. That's ours. We like it. Please go away. So he goes back, and he goes back to Tom Slick and says, and nothing doing. They're not going to give me the hand. And so Tom Slick is like, well, you're going to have to steal it, right? Which is not great, Tom, but okay. So that's, so Patrick's like, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to replace it with something. I'm going to need another dried hand, right? So Tom Slick, apparently, as Patrick Byrne later recounted, comes back with a brown paper bag and dumps a mummified human hand on the table and says, there you go. So Patrick Byrne goes back to Nepal. He goes back to the monastery. He gets the monk who's on Yeti hand guard duty, drunk, gets him passed out, swaps the hands out, takes the Yeti hand, and escapes out of Nepal. He ends up in India. But the question is, how are you going to get a contraband Yeti hand out of India, right? And he talks to Tom Slick, and Tom Slick's like, all right, go to the Calcutta hotel and talk to Jimmy Stewart, the actor. And so what apparently happens, and this, I couldn't believe that I double and triple checked this because I just could not believe the story was true, but it's verified by multiple sources that what happened is Jimmy Stewart and his wife agreed to smuggle this stolen Yeti hand out of India back to England by hiding it in his wife's lingerie case, knowing full well that the English customs officers were not going to go rooting around in a famous actor's wife's underwear. And sure enough, they didn't, and that's how they smuggled the Yeti hand into England. And once they got it back, it turned out that it was actually just a human hand. And it's sort of like, it's kind of a reminder, like it had a kind of cool magic and power as long as it was in that monastery.
Yeah.
But once these Westerners decided they were just going to, violate these monks, monastery and make off with this thing, it kind of, unsurprisingly, it lost all its magic, and it just wasn't the same.
Let's, because we're going to run out of time, let's change the subject because you cover so much in this book. Let's talk about UFOs a little bit. Tell us about the types of UFO sightings that you explored when you're writing the book, and how the curve of UFO sightings has been changing over the course of the years.
I thought this was really fascinating because, again, I mean, if you think about, like, the Loch Ness Monster, the idea of what the Loch Ness Monster looks like hasn't really changed since there were first sightings in the 1930s. But, like, the thing about UFOs is, like, again, whether or not you're a believer or not, and I'm pretty agnostic. I don't know what I myself believe. I have a real open mind. But I was really fascinated to see that, like, culturally, the way that we imagine UFOs has changed so dramatically in the past, like, even just, like, 60, 70 years, right? That, like, in the 1950s, I think I said this before, in the 1950s, it was, like, guys in silver jumpsuits with, like, long flowing hair and blue eyes, and they were like, the whole thing, the kind of 1950s, we come in peace, we're going to give you a utopian civilization as soon as you abandon nuclear weapons and all this kind of stuff. And that changes into the 60s and 70s to this idea that, no, actually they're humanoid, but they don't really look like us, and now they kind of secretly abduct us and wipe our memories and probe various orifices, and that's how, so I thought it was just really fascinating to kind of trace the different ways in which our belief about these things has changed so dramatically in such a short amount of time. And again, I think regardless of what you actually think, aliens, whether they exist and what they actually are, I think it's fair to say that I think, like, kind of on a cultural level, we have kind of shifted our understanding of what these things are, maybe to kind of, either fit our contemporary anxieties or our, kind of cultural obsessions of the moment, which I think is kind of a weird but kind of recurring facet of this belief system.
There's a famous sighting over Mount Rainier. Tell us about that one.
That's kind of the beginning of, I guess what you would call, like, the modern UFO sighting. One of the things that's cool about that sighting is this guy, Kenneth Arnold, who's a pilot, and he's a well-respected guy. He's not a crank. He's not known to, lie or hallucinate. And he is out flying solo over Mount Rainier, and he sees these silver, flying objects, and he describes them as sort of bat-wing shaped. But he doesn't know what they are. He thinks, I don't know, maybe it's Russia, maybe it's Soviet Union has some weird, spy craft or some weapon or something like that. So he lands his plane. He goes to the FBI, wants to tell the FBI, but the FBI office is closed because it's Saturday, so he doesn't know what to do. So he goes to the newspaper, and he tells the newspaper, the local newspaper in, somewhere in, I think, like, Bend, Oregon, just to get this story out. And, as I said, he describes them as bat-wing shaped, but he says they were flying like saucers skipped over the water. And, so he uses that word saucers as a metaphor to talk about how they're flying, but somehow through the course of the newspaper sort of, writing the story and then it getting picked up by the AP wire and spread out, it gets the details get altered, and it becomes about, quote unquote, flying saucers. So, like, the beginning of the flying saucer story and this kind of, craze of flying saucers is actually turns out to be a kind of just odd mistranslation of Kenneth Arnold trying to explain how these things moved across the sky.
And then there's another story about Gloria Lee, who was a contactee, and you include this story in your book.
There's something so tragic about Gloria Lee, but it's also, I think it's a story that really speaks to the time. She was a flight attendant who then began receiving messages from a being from the planet Venus whose name was JW, right? And JW told Gloria Lee, about kind of the utopian Venusian society, and among other things, the Venusians were really into free love, right? JW was like, we got to move beyond, single heterosexual coupling, and you should just have, amorous relationships with whomever you want, because that's how we do it in Venus, and look at us, we're doing great, right? So unsurprisingly, an attractive woman with a, message of free love, it takes off, right? So she gets pretty famous, and then JW tells her that she needs to go to Washington, D.C. and share his blueprints for flying saucers with the Congress of the United States so that they can build these things and then kind of usher in the U.S. into a new golden age of peace and prosperity. So off she goes to Washington, D.C. I think she's from L.A. She goes off to Washington, D.C., and it turns out Congress is not interested in her flying saucers blueprint. And so JW says to her, okay, here's what you got to do. Get a hotel and go on a hunger strike. And you just don't eat anything until either they start listening to you or, if need be, I will send down a flying saucer and take you up to Venus. And so Gloria Lee is in this Washington, D.C. hotel for I think 2 months before her husband back in L.A. gets a call from the hotel manager that's like, you gotta do something about your wife. She's very ill because she hasn't eaten anything in 2 months. And they call an ambulance for her, and unfortunately she dies on the way to the hospital from extreme malnourishment because she was on this hunger strike for 2 months and nobody could stop her from not eating. And so again, it's sort of, it's sad and it's tragic that this young woman died, and it also sort of speaks to the kind of way in which these stories kind of took on a life of their own, and sometimes even the people telling them kind of lost control of them. But there is a postscript. The publishing company that had published her first book, Why We Are Here, felt that Gloria was such an important bestseller for them that even her being dead wasn't going to stop them from making money off of her. So they continued to publish books after her death that were supposedly communicated to them from beyond the grave via spiritual mediums, and they continued to make a buck off of poor Gloria Lee. Really?
So they had somebody who claimed to be channeling Gloria and writing down these messages and publishing them.
Yeah. There were Gloria, quote unquote, Gloria Lee published, I think, 2 or 3 books after her death.
Wow. But I did note that while nobody could stop her on the hunger strike, that flying saucer from Venus never came to take her either.
Yeah, which is a real, if I can say, a real jerk move on the part of our friend JW. I mean, it's one thing if you're going to, demand this kind of devotion, but you should at least, send down the rescue flying saucer as far as I'm concerned.
So the book is available now, Colin?
Oh, yeah. It's out now. Anywhere you buy books, it should be there.
And just because you've written a few books here, we mentioned their names like Ghostland and Cranioclepty. Is there any particular order you recommend people read your work in, or they can start with any book they want?
Well, I like this one. I think it and Ghostland are probably my favorites. The other two are kind of funky and weird, but I think between Ghostland and the Unidentified, you get a pretty wide sweep of some kind of weird stuff and maybe some unexpected stories that you hadn't heard before, or hopefully you haven't heard before. That's my goal.
You've obviously written about ghosts in Ghostland and American history and haunted places. Did you do anything with ghosts in the Unidentified?
I didn't, just in the sense that I had really, I felt like I had kind of done that once. I didn't want to kind of go back to the well. I mean, there's certainly a little bit of overlap in the way that, Madame Blavatsky sort of started as a spiritualist, and, you see kind of parallels here and there, but I felt like I kind of done that, and I didn't want to kind of keep going back over and over to the same ground.
Colin, this was always, it's always fun to have you on the program. I always get first of all, a lot of great information, some great stories, and a laugh or two along the way as well. Promise you'll come back after you write your next book, because I'm sure you've got another one in the works somewhere.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. I'd love to come back. I had a great time.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by J.V. Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y, at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.